This may shock and amaze you, but I'm going to whip Joe Frazier. The immortal words of Muhammad Ali before the fight of the century. This is Robert Manni, host of Guys TV, and this week my very special guest is author Glenn Lewis. He's written a book about Smokin' Joe Frazier and his rivalry with Muhammad Ali. It all starts right here, right now on Guys TV. You can also catch me on KCAA Radio in Southern California and on Guys Radio, my worldwide podcast. Guys TV, Guys Radio. Thanks for your support. Okay, Guys Radio, and you know it's the very most famous and favorite part of my show, which is the interviews, because I bring in all these wonderful guests who have stories and experiences and journeys and insights to share with us. And I've got a great one today. His name is Glenn Lewis, and he's written a book called Sparring with Smokin' Joe. It's about Joe Frazier, the professional boxer, heavyweight champ, kind of an underrated heavyweight, and yet probably one of the top 5 of all time, and a very interesting man with an interesting journey. And Glenn has done a spectacular job researching, working with the Frazier and the Frazier family, and putting this book together. But let me tell you a little bit about Glenn before we bring him out. He's a director of journalism at York College, CUNY, and a professor at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY, where he has long taught nonfiction book writing seminars, and I should really take one because I'm working on one now. Lewis, a veteran journalist, has written about sports and a wide range of other topics. His work has appeared in Publishers Weekly, Sport, Car and Driver, 17, Family Weekly, Library Journal, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and many other publications. You can see he's very well read, and he's written about a number of big topics. In 1980, Glenn spent several months covering Joe Frazier and his inner circle during what was a crossroads in the legendary fighter's life and career. It was kind of at the tail end. And it's an interesting way to do kind of a biography, because he's picking up kind of after some things happened, but before other things would happen. He did a wonderful job with this book. Sparring with Smokin' Joe has been named one of the top 10 sports books of 2021 by the American Library Association. As a sports writer, Glenn has also written about the Olympics, NBA, Duke basketball, which I don't like because I went to Villanova, and the rise of women's sports. Glenn's interviewed Reggie Jackson, Bruce Jenner, Bill Bradley, Walter Payton, and many other sports stars, and he's profiled iconic media figures, including Walter Cronkite, David Halberstam, Jim Layer, Betty Friedan, Studs Terkel, many others. He's an on-air journalist, expert for Fox News. He co-authored The Big Beauty Book, which is a little bit out of the box based on this other work I'm reading about, a popular health and advice title with a Ford model, and he co-authored this Southside Sluggers baseball mystery series for Simon & Schuster, and also served as editor and sole writer for a volume of the Encyclopedia of Journalism. So this is a man of letters and a very, very smart guy, and he's written a terrific book, Sparring with Smokin' Joe, an intimate sports narrative by Glenn Lewis, full of never been before told stories about Joe Frazier that shows him and his rival, Muhammad Ali, in a totally new light. Welcome to Guys Radio, Glenn Lewis.
Hi, well, I'm so glad to be here and anxious to talk about the book.
Awesome. So let's start at the very beginning. Your journey with Joe Frazier began in earnest around 1980, which was really at the end of his career. A few years after his first retirement, actually, he came back for one more fight and didn't go well. He got a lucky draw on that. But how did you come upon this project? And how did you gain access and the trust of Frazier and his family?
Good questions. I had done an interview with Joe and his son, Mathis, who was then the #1 amateur in the United States, a few months before for a different magazine. And we got to know each other, and we were comfortable with each other from that one day of interviewing. Then Esquire magazine contacted me and heard rumors that Ali was going to come back to fight Larry Holmes for the heavyweight championship the following year. And they thought that might prompt Joe to come out of retirement. They heard rumors and they wanted to confirm whether that was true or not. And if Joe was going to come out of retirement, they thought that potentially it would lead to an Ali Frazier 4, which would have been the mother of all fights. And so they wanted me to rekindle my friendship with Joe, and to get his personal look at how this decision was being made and what it would be like confronting Ali again.
What was it about Joe Frazier, Glenn, that drew you to him? Were you a boxing fan, a Frazier fan as a boxer, or did you respect him as somebody who had a tough journey, was very, as you say, very resilient and a hard worker, very determined, kind of used every tool he had in the toolkit to really make his way? That every man could relate to him.
Well, you know, it's funny. At first, I started out like so many people from my generation. When you got to realize, I did this interview 40 years ago. So I was, you know, around 30 at the time. And I was a huge Ali fan. You know, I wanted Ali to kill Frazier in that first fight, the fight of the century. You know, you got to remember, back then, this was not just a sporting event. This was a confrontation, a political confrontation, a cultural confrontation. People felt passionate about both sides and both fighters. You didn't just want a guy to win, you wanted him to obliterate the other guy and prove you right and prove your causes right. And so I went into those fights, you know, admiring Ali, hating Joe, and then I wound up a few years later interviewing him. And I was actually really surprised. Number one, how much I liked him. I was surprised how resilient he was, how smart he was. I underestimated, to be honest, how smart he was and how smart he would be in figuring out what it would take to answer tough questions and still be honest and human about his answers. Mm-hmm. And he surprised me at every step along the way. And that became sort of his trademark in a way. He was a very resilient guy. He developed certain attitudes and certain ways of dealing with loss, whether it was a loss of a fight, a loss of respect in public from an interview, Ali's picking on him, whatever it was, he developed a certain resilience, an ability to like swallow the loss and come back. You know, he talked about everything being only a party. It's a party. It's only a party. And at first, it seemed kind of trite. Like I was sort of thinking to myself, boy, that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at life. But he really took it to heart, and he was able to overcome those feelings immediately.
Wow. Okay. My special guest on Guys Radio is Glenn Lewis. He's written an incredible book that I just finished called Sparring with Smokin' Joe, Joe Frazier's Epic Battle and Rivalry with Muhammad Ali. But we've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's just start with his childhood for some context. He grew up in Beaufort, South Carolina on a farm. He ended up going off on his own because he didn't feel he was getting the respect he deserved, and he didn't think he would be able to kind of climb up and out of his situation in South Carolina. So he ended up in Philadelphia, and that's what everybody knows him being Philly. That's where he kind of landed. He went up to New York, and then he ended up in Philadelphia. He had a tough childhood. He was a tough kid, but he wasn't really a bully. What did you learn about Joe Frazier's character from these formative years?
That's a good question. You got to remember, this was the tail end of the Jim Crow South. So he was growing up essentially in the Jim Crow South. He was a very tough kid, very husky kid, very outspoken. It's funny, Ali was known as the outspoken one and Joe was the quiet one. But Joe as a kid was strong in his beliefs and strongly outspoken. And it's funny, a lot of times he used to criticize Ali. He would say, well, you know, you're a middle-class kid. You grew up in Louisville from middle-class parents. You know, you had money. You didn't know what it was like. I had grow up in the Jim Crow South, and I stood up for myself, and that was life and death. And he described a couple of things in the book where he spoke up, to the overseer of a plantation he was working on, where the guy had been beating some of the other young guys who were working, on the plantation. And he threatened Joe. He said, if you don't keep quiet, you're going to get a beating, you're going to do this. And Joe stood up to him. And literally because of that, he had to leave home because his mother was afraid he was going to be lynched.
It's amazing story that people don't realize that this stuff hasn't gone away completely yet either. And that's very recent history. So very sad. I found the passages about Buster Mathis very interesting. Now, Buster Mathis was a bigger guy. He was a rival. He was kind of a precursor of Muhammad Ali for Joe Frazier, in my opinion, in that he was bigger, he was slicker, he was more polished, he had the reputation. Joe fought him twice and actually lost to him in the Olympic trials by a kind of a questionable decision. And then they went to Tokyo and Mathis didn't train and Frazier got the nod and he went in there and won the gold medal. That tells you something about this guy's character. And then they fought as pros. Talk to us a little bit about that as a precursor to the Ali rivalry. At least that's how I took it, Glenn.
That's a great thing to pick up on. Buster Mathis really frustrated Joe. He was, first of all, he was almost 300 pounds. So he really outweighed him. He was a big guy, tall. But the thing that Joe underestimated was how quick his movements were, how quick his hands were, and his ability to move around the ring. He was much more agile than Joe gave him credit for. And he really didn't adjust well to his agility over those amateur fights. He didn't know as much, so you don't adapt as well. So he beat Joe a couple of times. He was the only guy who beat Joe in the amateurs, and then he beat him in the Olympic trial. But Joe figured a lot of things out as a pro. And he actually fought him in 1968 for his first championship. The first, when Ali left in 67, they had a tournament that included the top 8 boxers in the heavyweight ranks. And they fought each other. It was an elimination tournament for who would be the new WBA champ. And Joe took a chance. He said, I'm the #1 ranked guy. I'm not taking part in that tournament. You hold the tournament. Whoever wins that tournament, I'll fight them for the championship. But I'm not going to lower myself to be part of that tournament. And, it was a risk. They eliminated Joe from the tournament. They said he was rated #9. We really needed rated number one. But instead, he fought Buster Mathis in 1968 for the New York State Championship, and which was also a piece of the heavyweight championship. And he knocked him out in that fight. He finally, again, he was always a student of boxing. He learned to work with that agility. And also he became a faster starter. Joe was always a slow starter. And Yank Durham taught him to start faster in fights and to work to figure out boxes better. And he figured out Mathis and knocked him out.
It was a different era, Glenn, with the boxers actually used to fight each other repeatedly. Joe fought Jimmy Ellis, who was kind of he was a sparring partner of Muhammad Ali and also kind of a mini version of him, if you will. Jerry Quarry, who was a tough guy, he fought him twice. Bonavina from Argentina, very tough and questionable tactics, fought him twice. And then he had 3 fights with Ali, 2 with Foreman. I always wondered why he never fought. Why didn't Joe Frazier and fight Ken Norton?
That's interesting.
Because you know why, Glenn? He said in the book, he said, I like to fight guys, who have the body of like a Ken Norton, but he never fought him.
Yeah, well, first of all, he loved smaller heavyweights because he slaughtered them.
Yeah,
He
right.
didn't just beat them, he slaughtered them. So, and a lot of the lighter heavyweights were really afraid of him. They didn't match up well. He was stronger than they were. He worked inside, which was unusual for a small heavyweight. He had knockout punch power. He moved very well. Joe was deceptive. A lot of people thought he didn't move well because they were comparing him to Ali, and Ali danced, and Ali was more dramatic in the way he moved around. But Joe was a master at bobbing and weaving, and he would work his way into an opponent's defense by bobbing and weaving and slipping punches, and would do a lot of damage inside. So small heavyweights were scared, really scared of him, and avoided him.
Ali and Frazier, they actually started out, and I want you to get into this, as kind of friends, because Joe Frazier, people don't realize that he actually testified on behalf of Ali. He lent him money, and all leading up to their fight. And Ali always told him, "You'll never be able to beat me, Joe." And Joe was like, "Yeah, we'll see." But they were on this collision course for a long time. And when that fight was set, then the animosity began. And it seemed to come from Ali's side because he was basically making fun of Frazier's, lack of education, his looks. He made him out to be kind of like he called him the gorilla and stuff like that. And the taunts got dialed up when heading towards the Thrilla in Manila. It just got more and more personal. What was that all about? And I get Frazier was very upset by this. So tell us a little bit about that.
All right. Well, first of all, Joe said to me, I asked him about that the first day that we got together. And I sort of pointed out, like, he never quite handled the Ali public argument very well. He seemed to always be at a loss.
Right.
And that sort of surprised me. And that's the way people came to know Joe. And it didn't seem to fit with the way he handled other things. And I asked him about that. And he said that a big part of it was he was really hurt. He felt that he and Ali had started as very close friends. They worked out together. They supported each other early on. Ali went to the 1960 Olympics. Joe was at the 64 Olympics. They both won championships. They had a very similar beginning of their careers. And he was shocked, really shocked, that this friend of his, when he went to promote the first fight, that, the fight of the century, was calling him a gorilla, was saying how bad he smelled, was talking about himself as the good, the smart, the talented Black man, and Joe was the poor
Uncle Tom, basically.
Uncle Tom.
He called him that, right?
Yeah,
exactly. And that's a terrible thing to say. And it's interesting that and we all have such reverence for Ali and all the different work he did that transcended boxing, but that kind of stuff was, that was pretty much overlooked and at the expense of Joe Frazier. So I'm so glad, Glenn, that you're here. I'm so glad you did this book, Sparring with Smoke and Joe. So let's keep going. Now we get to the fight of the century. And
I did want to say one
Please.
thing about that. A big part of that taunting was that he was setting himself up and promoting the fight as the Black man's champion.
Exactly.
And he kept calling Joe the white man's champion. Mm-hmm. So he set him up as a hero for his people. And Joe was supposedly the Black man that sold his people out, that couldn't be trusted. And that sort of stuck after so many,
It was the narrative
So many successful
that people got. That's the narrative. Like,
yeah, that was the narrative
right.
over 3 fights that lasted, 4 or 5 years. And that stayed with Joe years later. When I was with him down in Augusta, Georgia, he was appearing in black nightclubs, with his band, and white nightclubs. And when he went into the black nightclubs, these were his people. These were people who grew up, he grew up 100 miles from there. So there were a lot of these were poor farmers. They were his people. And yet he was getting a lot of taunts about Ali, about, selling his people out. And this was years later. And it was just left over from Ali creating this fabrication.
Okay, let's get into the 3 fights, Glenn. The first one, the fight of the century, Madison Square Garden, 1971, March 8th, I believe. Frank Sinatra was a photographer for life. Norman Mailer wrote about it. All the stars were there. And it was a great matchup because Frazier was in his prime. Ali had been out. He came back. He had 2 warm-up fights. He was, you could call him in his prime. He wasn't like as fast. He was bigger. And so they got in there, and it was exactly what you would expect. Ali pecking and poking, pouring water on your smoking, and then Frazier boring his way in. And finally, and the cataclysmic climactic moment in the 15th round, he had that roundhouse left hook that took Ali down and sealed the fate of the fight right there. Tell us about that fight? Any other things, insights we need to know?
Okay, well, obviously coming into the fight, people were really polarized. As we said before, the crowd was heavily for Ali, yet Joe had a lot of support as well. Ali took the early rounds. He was mostly jabbing and moving away and jabbing and moving away. And he scored well, but he wasn't doing damage. As the fight wore on, Joe started to get inside his defenses. He really stunned him in the 11th round, almost put him out. And yet they didn't even count that as a knockdown.
Right.
So Ali's knees and hands hit the canvas, and they did not count it as a knockdown, brushed it off. So there was a lot of looking out for Ali during that fight. But Joe in the 15th round, as you said, caught him with a roundhouse and put him down, and he got up, and literally Ali spent the whole round just trying to hang on.
It's interesting that, you talk about, Ali being the smart one and Joe being more challenged, but Joe's team figured out that Ali dropped his right, I believe, when he was setting up for an uppercut. And that's how Frazier, the entire fight, was looking for that opening. He got it in the 11th, and then he got it again in the 15th. And that's how he dropped Ali.
That's a good point. Matter of fact, that's an excellent point. Ali early, it's interesting. Ken Burns in that Ali documentary that's on PBS as we're speaking.
Yep.
In the first episode, he's talking about Ali's coming up and his early fights and turning pro and all that. And Ali early on was dancing and had fast hands, but he was making a reputation on doing something very unusual. When he would get into the fight, he would back away from his opponent just as he was delivering the punch. So the punch would not really connect. His arms would be fully extended, and then he could counter punch, and he did a lot of damage that way. But it's dangerous, because you're still in line for that punch. And if you don't time it just right, you can get hurt. He did this in lieu of slipping and sliding side to side, which was considered safer, but more predictable. And he got caught a couple of times. He was knocked down a couple of times in fights where the guy never should have touched him, but he came back from those and he rallied and he covered it up. As a pro, he was more known for being able to punch off of rhythm, or he was able to circle and dance and punch off of motion. And that was his gift. Joe got close enough and figured out the pattern to the dancing. So a lot of times Ali was rotating instead of away from the punch, was rotating into the punch. So when Joe would catch him, he would catch him flush, and he did tremendous damage that way. And people don't realize how difficult it is to figure out that pattern and to hit a guy at just the right time, in just the right distance. I mean, Joe, that was a talent that Joe had.
Yeah, people don't realize it. I've been to a lot of heavyweight fights. I used to go to with a buddy of mine. We'd go down to Atlantic City. So a lot of Tyson fights, what we would do is we'd wait till like 5 minutes before the card would begin, and then we'd buy our tickets and then go in and get a good price, and we get right up close to the ring. And the thing that really amazed me was that with the heavyweights, it's one shot. These guys can take each other out in one shot. They are big, strong guys, and it's very dangerous. And so you have to be really careful if you're a heavyweight, because it doesn't matter if you're better than the guy. They all have the capability of knocking the other guy out with one shot, and they're very dangerous and big. And you know what? That ring is real small. It's not what it looks like on TV. It's like you're in a phone booth with somebody, and it's like, wow, there's no escape. You're in there, you're in there. So you understand why some of these fighters sometimes look like, oh no, I can't believe I'm here, particularly with a fighter like Tyson, because there's no place to go but down and out. And that's what happened. But let's get back to the trilogy here. So what happens after the first fight is Frazier takes on, he could have taken an easy fight like Ali did, but he takes on George Foreman. Boxing is all about styles. It was a totally bad choice, and he gets knocked down 6 times and he loses. Ali has a safer fight. I'm not sure who he fought, but it was an easy one. And then their paths cross again, and it's a 12-round fight. Ali Frazier 2. And in this fight, it was very, very obvious that Ali's team had figured out the way to how you deal with Frazier is you pile up the points with the jab. When he comes in, you hold him around the neck and just you hold him, you grab him. And I thought it was just a lousy fight. The second fight, it was interesting that it was 12 rounds. I was wondering why, because this was back in the day when the fights were 15 rounds, but it was a close decision. A lot of people have gone back and watched that fight, including yourself, Glenn, and said, you know what, Frazier really won this fight. Tell us about Ali Frazier 2.
Okay, that was called the rematch, and happened in '74 at Madison Square Garden, where the first fight was. And again, the boxing establishment was desperate to have Ali win that fight. A loss pretty much would have killed his appeal to the public. Losing 2 in a row to Frazier, it would have prevented his fight with Foreman. The Rumble in the Jungle would have never happened. So they needed him to win. They needed him to be Ali. And you're right, he was a little bit afraid. I think Frazier surprised him, damaged him, and he realized he was a little bit in trouble. So he was throwing a lot of soft punches and running away, and then holding and soft punches and running away. Frazier was standing in there, and he was not punching as much, but the punches that he was connecting with were solid and did much more damage. They wound up judging this fight the way you would judge an amateur fight, because an amateur fight is just on touches.
Right.
So whether you're throwing a jab or you're throwing a knockout punch, it counts the same. And they really scored it like an amateur fight, which was, not the intention. And Joe kept on saying to me while we were together, in that second fight, I was wrong. I was wrong. And I went back finally, sort of to shut him up. I went and looked back round by round to see what happened. And he was robbed. I mean, probably was a fairly close fight, but Frazier won it like, 7-4, 1 even, or something like that. The interesting thing was Red Smith was a columnist, very famous columnist for the New York Times. And Dave Anderson was also a columnist for the New York Times. Both won Pulitzer Prizes, both were boxing experts. And when I went back and checked their columns after the fight, both of them had said Joe Frazier was robbed and he won the fight.
Amazing.
So that convinced me to go back and re-examine it.
Amazing. My special guest, Glenn Lewis, we're having a great time talking about Sparring with Smokin' Joe, his award-winning book here. I want to get to the third fight, but I also want to just take a pause and let's give praise to Muhammad Ali, because not only he was a figure, we're big Frazier fans, but Ali was a political figure. He bucked the draft. He got punished for it. He took his punishment and came back bigger than ever. And he did a lot of work for people around the world, and just spiritually. And he did, to me, he had the most amazing performance and strategy when he fought George Foreman. So what happened? Frazier had got knocked out by Foreman. I don't know if it was for the second time, whatever. Ali fought Foreman in Zaire, and he did the rope-a-dope, and he knocked him out. This wasn't a split decision or something like that. He knocked out Foreman, the unbeatable Foreman, in the 8th round. And that set up another fight for, I'm not sure if that set up the second or the third fight, but I just want to take a pause here and say something about Ali, Glenn, and then we'll get to Thrilla in Manila, because eventually the paths collide again in the Philippines in an indoor venue, very hot, no air conditioning. And these are two guys who are like a little bit beyond their prime, and they've had a couple of wars together, and this was the ultimate war.
That's true. Look, Ali was a great man for his political stance. Ali appealed to a part of the culture that was not being listened to, was not being served. He forced the government, he forced society to consider certain problems and to argue them and to honor them in a way. So he was tremendous force, much more than any sports guy would normally be. They talk about sports guys being, role models and stuff like that. He went way beyond the idea of a role model. He created and enhanced political movements. Mm-hmm. And political movements that usually led to social justice. And that's unique.
Yep. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that, because, Ali transcended the athletics, and he did a lot. And it's interesting because you have these two guys that we both respect so much, and they had different types of contributions, but we don't want to overlook Joe Frazier. And that's what, Glenn, your book is about, and you did such a wonderful job. Let's just touch on Thrilla in Manila from your perspective, and then let's get into to me, the meat of the book is Joe and his family and his relationship with his son, and really gives you an insight as to the type of individual he became after his career. So let's start with Thrilla in Manila.
All right, with the Thrilla in Manila, well, first of all, my coverage of that fight wound up being really unique in a way, because I covered it, way after the fight took place. I mean, I wasn't, with his entourage for the fight. So I used interviews with Joe and Mathis together to talk about the fight. And so their whole approach became a very personal view of the fight. So I didn't get a boxing view as much as a personal view. And Joe described first the pre-fight routine, and he would be in the locker room with his son praying before the fight. And it was funny because he didn't talk about praying to win. He didn't talk about praying to beat up Ali. He talked about just praying to have the intestinal fortitude to show up, to represent himself well, to fight a good fight. He saw himself as almost like a religious warrior in a way. You know, he took the fighting as almost like a religious experience, and he just wanted to represent his side well. And so he talked about the warrior culture that both fighters had, you know, leading into the fight. From Mathis' point of view, he was talking about what it was like to watch a fight from ringside, where he started to realize after a while that his father might lose, and his father was getting beaten up. And the idea of watching your role model, your father, you know,
Sure.
taking that abuse. And it got very emotional, you know, for the fight that way. But the other thing that people don't realize is they both took a tremendous amount of punishment. They both had many rounds that they did serious damage. It was 130 degrees in the arena. And then they were under bright lights, which made it more like 150 degrees. They were literally melting. They were totally dehydrated by the 14th round. Literally, Ali couldn't lift his arms anymore. Joe's eyes were closing. So both fighters were actually preparing not to come out for the 15th round. And Joe's side, led by Eddie Futch, who took over from Yank Durham, he just happened to quit, you know, 30 seconds before Ali's, you know, side would have quit. And as a matter of fact, Ali said after the fight, that was the closest to dying I ever experienced.
It's amazing. So after that, their careers were never the same.
They
Joe
weren't.
had some
They were
other
never-
fights. Yeah, and they, as like a lot of the sad story for a lot of older experienced boxers who's given so much, they end up being on the receiving end at the end of their career. So both their careers end. And Joe goes off and he sets up the Joe Frazier Review. I thought it was called Joe Frazier and the Knockouts. I was on, Glenn, I
Yeah.
was on vacation to the Virginia Beach with some buddies of mine, and we saw Joe Frazier's playing in town. This was back in around 1980-ish. And we said, let's go see him. So we we had front row seats in this club, the small club, and he came around, he sang all these songs, and he came around to shake everybody's hands. And when he got to us, he put two fingers out, his index finger and his middle finger. And that's how big his hand was, because I shook hands and that's all I could get my hand just about around those. I've never seen a guy with bigger hands, like meteor hands, in my entire life. And he was just, wow, you could really see the power in this guy. And it was so funny. The next day we saw him at the car wash with his gang, not his gang, what am I saying? His troop, really. And they were getting the car wash, and he had on a leather vest and no shirt. And it was just like he had come from the club or something. It was so hilarious. And I felt bad because here was a guy who was a hero of mine, and I got to meet him, but you know, he was just getting his car washed like everybody else, and off they went. And I was like, wow, what a story. But you mentioned actually his the Joe Frazier Review, and you know, he wasn't a great singer, but he put his all into his work. And then a lot of your book focuses on that relationship between Mathis, his son, and Joe, and how Joe wanted to shape Mathis into a mini version of Joe Frazier, even in boxing style, when his son wasn't really meant for that. And it ended up in him getting crushed by Mike Tyson, who was on the way up. It was probably a bad fight for them to pick. And they also threw him in with Larry Holmes, and he got his head handed to him in that one also. And it really showed you know, a different part of Frazier, which is a very stubborn guy, very tough father, always thought he was right. Did that change your perspective of him at all?
No, I mean, that sort of confirmed what I believe, but Joe really mismanaged, you know, Mathis. First of all, let's be straight about Mavis's career and Mathis as a fighter. Mathis was a much better fighter than anyone ever gave him credit for. He was 19-2 as a professional, and his 2 losses, as you mentioned, were to Larry Holmes, who was the heavyweight champ then, and had won 44 straight fights and had won, 17 or 18 championship fights in a row at that point, and he was fighting him after 10 pro fights. Joe put him in much too early, and his loss to Tyson. Tyson was in his prime. Joe underestimated Tyson as a contender. He was the number 2 contender at that time. Mathis was maybe number 10. He should have fought 3 or 4 more fights before getting in the ring with Tyson. So both fights, he fought the fights prematurely. He really didn't stand a chance from maturity or experience-wise. If he had fought either fighter a year later or a year and a half later, it might have been a different story.
Amazing.
So he could have, if he had stayed with George Benton, who used to be known as the Professor, a great boxing trainer. If he had stayed with him as his trainer, I believe he would have been a heavyweight champ.
Okay, our very special guest, Glenn Lewis. Let's just wrap up on what happened with Joe. 2011, I think he got liver cancer. He died like within 2 months. And the good news is that not his passing, but they have a statue of Rocky, Sylvester Stallone, in Pennsylvania, in Philly. And now they put up a statue of the much more deserving. I mean, from an artistic standpoint, yes, Stallone and Rocky deserve that statue. But from a human standpoint, and somebody who's a real man, not a fictional character, who really did the job, Joe Frazier got his statue in front of a NBC Universal building there. So there's a happy ending to that, at least, that he's finally getting his due. People like yourself, Glenn, are giving Joe Frazier his due as a human being, as a boxer, an athlete, and somebody who just shows, like, the underdog. You want to pull for the underdog. You respect resiliency. It's about never giving up. And I got a lot out of it in terms of a story about life, really, and how life is, the ups and downs, the realities. You did a wonderful job. Thank you for being on Guys Radio. I want you to tell everybody out there where they can find your book and more about you, Glenn.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, you can look for the book on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and bookstores, wherever books are sold. And of course, you can lend it from your library. The American Library Association recognized the book, so I'd like to recognize the libraries. And also, my Twitter account is at Glenn Lewis NYC, and the Facebook account is glenn.lewis.nyc. I have some big events coming up, and I'll publicize those events on there. But I think the conversation about Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali is just getting started. There's been a lot done in different publications recently about the best individual sports rivalry in history. And this has always been recognized as the best in boxing. And now it's starting to be recognized as the best individual sports rivalry in history. You can look at Jack Nicklaus and
Arnold Palmer,
Palmer in golf, and Bird and
Magic,
and things like that. But this is recognized as the best.
Awesome. Well, great job. The name of the book, Sparring with Smokin' Joe, Joe Frazier's epic battles and rivalry with Ali. But there's much, much more in it. It's a real human story, and you're a terrific writer. You did a great job. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope we can do it again, Glenn.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for a really wonderful interview. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. If you enjoy the guests and content we bring you each and every week to Guys Radio, and please support us by subscribing to our channels. Thank you.